The Brantford Cordage Company was operational from 1901 to 1972. Originally started by C.L. Messacar, the plant was located in a 212,000 square foot manufacturing space in West Brant, on what is now Sherwood Drive. A mill fire in 1913 caused $100,000 worth of damages, but they rebuilt in 1915 with the addition of a second mill and another warehouse. Production jumped to 8,000 tons a year, and it was described as the finest cord that money could buy in the 1900s. By 1916, they began to make rope as well, and by 1924, they were the largest producer of binder twine in the British Empire. At this time, there was a third mill and warehouse added, and the company had 400 employees that produced 20,000 tons of twine a year. Brantford Cordage produced 4 varieties at its peak: the Gilt Edge, Gold Leaf, Silver Leaf, and Maple Leaf, and they used ingredients from all over the world, from New Zealand, Mexico, and the Philippines. In June 1931, the government issued new import and export taxes, and though binder cord itself was exempt, importing American cord would have been cheaper for consumers since the raw materials to make Canadian cord would have been taxed. The Cordage Company immediately gave up, and this was such a big deal, the government heard it was shutting down and clarified that the raw materials would be exempt as well for the production of binder twine. The introduction of the combine harvester in the 1940s reduced the need for binder twine, and in 1948, the company changed gears in what they were producing. Binder twine was being manufactured in the first mill, baler twine in the second, and rope in the third. Between 1948 and 1951, there was a complete update to all the machinery in the factories. Brantford Cordage unionized in the late 1940s, and the family atmosphere for the employees seemed to disappear. In 1958, the business was sold to the Gardner Group of Toronto and became a division of Tancord. In 1968, new management and equipment troubles resulted in a substantial loss of money. Though they still had 350 employees and produced 100,000 pounds of twine and rope per day, the operation was just not the same. In 1972, operations halted, which put about 250 to 300 people out of work. Cockshed Plow Company was founded in 1878 by James Cockshed, the son of Brantford business mogul Ignatius. James began his career as an apprentice at the Watrous Engine Works, and Ignatius was not too happy that his eldest son was taking up a blacksmithing career, but provided him with a $15,000 startup nonetheless. The business started as the Brantford Plow Works, but when James died in 1887, it was incorporated as Cockshed Plow with William F. Cockshed, James's brother, as president. The company sold plows that excelled in the prairies, which allowed them to sell quite a few as Canada went west. The JGC riding plow allowed for one man to do twice the work, and sold for 47 years after its introduction in 1885. By 1888, WF went back to the family retail business, and another Cockshed brother, Frank, took over as president. At that point, the company outgrew their initial factory, and in 1896, the original plant was torn down and replaced with a new 4 to 5 story plant on the same Market Street site. In 1903, a 33-acre plant and offices were built on Mohawk Street. Through World War I, the company had many unfulfilled orders due to the lack of men and materials, but large cash reserves and financial responsibility allowed for success. During World War II, Cocksheds had the largest production of steel engine manifolds and plain undercarriages in Canada because they had one of the few 600-pound presses that were able to make the frames. At the height of wartime production, they employed about 1,000 people, and they were mostly women. In the late 1940s, they had almost 50% of the market selling combines and tractors, and by 1950, 40% of Cockshed's product was exported. In 1951, the company name was changed from Cockshed Plow Co. to the Cockshed Farm Equipment, and they added tractors, combines, and other large farm equipment to their repertoire. Cocksheds hit trouble in the 1960s and were bought out by a Cleveland corporation and combined them with other factories to make white farm equipment, which went out of business in 1985, and the combine designs and patents were sold to Massey Ferguson. First founded in Exeter originally in 1857, Verity's was known for making plows and stoves. In 1875, the company sold their stove patents to John McClary and focused on high-class plows. Between 1892 and 1895, they left Exeter, leaving 200 people unemployed, but came to Brantford. The original Verity site in Brantford was at Wellington and Clarence Street. Also in 1895, Verity's was bought out by Massey Harris, with 40% of the company's stocks going to them. In 1897, there was an explosion on the third floor of the Verity building that was rapidly rebuilt. A few years later, the company moved to the site off of Greenwich and Mohawk, between the canal and the TH&B tracks, right next door to their biggest Canadian competitor, which was Cockshed's. In 1914, Verity Plow was wholly acquired by Massey's and remained a subsidiary, and by the end of the 1930s, they had become the primary producer of nuts and bolts for all Massey Harris plants in Canada, producing 20 million parts a year by 1950. In 1988, the bankruptcy of Massey Combines led to the closure of Verity as well, and the demolition of the Massey Harris buildings in 1996 left the Verity site as the oldest surviving farm machinery office building in the city. Now, Massey Harris was founded by Alanson Harris, who started off as a miller in Ingersoll. In the 1870s, he moved the company to Market Street South. Harris made farm implements and was convinced to come to Brantford through tax benefits, being a 5-year tax exemption on the provision that he employed 30 men. In 1881, the business was incorporated under the name A. Harris & Sons Company. In 1883, the operation produced 1,750 mowers, 1,275 reapers, and 1,000 binders, giving their competitor Massey Manufacturing from Toronto stiff competition. By 1887, 28 machines were being produced per day by 300 men. And by 1891, they merged with Massey Manufacturing and became Massey Harris. In 1903, their Market Street South property extended 9 acres through the purchase of the former Cockshed property. 2 years later, in 1905, all 4 founding members had passed away, which left the company in the hands of the next generation. Like Cockshed's, Massey Harris switched to shell production during the First World War. In 1915, production of farm equipment was at 45% below pre-war level, so the switch to shell production was immensely productive, as they made $903,000 by shell sales alone in 1916. The company spread out in the 1920s, and by 1930 had 9 worldwide plants, with 3 of them being in Canada. Sales slowed in the 30s, and company funds grew tight. During World War II, Massey's manufactured mortar bombs and treads for tanks. In 1952, the company purchased the Harry Ferguson Company and became Massey Ferguson. When the plant in Toronto became overworked, they built a massive complex up by Wayne Gretzky Parkway. And the expansion of their worldwide plants in the 1960s left massive debts for the business, and high interest rates in the late 1970s made conditions unsavory. In 1982, they reported a loss of $413 million, and by 1988, the company had closed its doors completely in Brantford, though they are still currently operating out of Georgia in the United States. Charles H. Watrous was an American who joined P.C. Van Brocklin at a foundry in Brantford in 1848. Watrous was tasked with reorganizing and turning the company around. And they started off small and struggling as in 1854, Van Brocklin left, so Watrous partnered with Joseph Ganson to create Ganson, Watrous & Co. This plant was later bought out with funding from Ignatius Cockshed. The original factory was located at the corner of Darling and Queen Street, and there were 4 buildings on this block, 15,000 square feet and 45 employees. They started out making sawmills, but eventually expanded to making boilers and 25-mile-per-hour steam engines. Watrous and Ignatius Cockshed were the masterminds behind an early fire hydrant system in Brantford as well. Cockshed ran the fire companies, and Watrous invented a steam engine to pump water from an underground pipe system. In 1870, the Waterworks Company was created, and this concept spread around the Eastern Dominion. The company then started making horse-drawn, steam-powered fire trucks, and they also added sawmills, shingle mills, planing machines, and edgers to their mandate in the 1860s. And throughout the 1860s, Ignatius Cockshed gradually reduced his role in the company, since the money he had originally invested was to help them through a rough patch, and the company at this point was doing quite well. It was in 1876 to 1877 that the company first lost money, and this was due to the installation of a waterworks system in Ontario and Quebec, and the construction was really at the mercy of the weather. As a result, Cockshed and Watrous didn't take a personal salary in 1878, and they instead invested that $31,000 of personal funds back into the business. And this seemed to work, as in 1880 the company turned a profit of $95,000. In the early 1890s, employment was up to 250 people, and they were running out of space at the Darling Street site. So in 1895, the company moved to a 25-acre site on Market Street South. The city bought the Darling Street property for $40,000, and Watrous put that money into building the new factory. From 1909 to 1912, the Brantford site began importing parts from their Minnesota plant to build gas-powered water pumpers. By 1915, steam engines were a thing of the past, so the operation focused more on machinery for the paper industry. Like many other Brantford industrial sites, Watrous produced shells for the military during World War I, as well as sawmills to make boards for the trenches. During the economic downturn in the 1930s, Watrous started making plows when the need from the paper industry nosedived. Again, the Second World War increased production and shifted 80% of the company's output to shells by 1940. In 1944, the Watrous plant closed shop for a day to mark their 100-year anniversary, the first Canadian manufacturer to mark that occasion. By 1947, there was no family member in line to take over the presidency, so the company was sold to a group of Toronto businessmen. And this was the first time that the company wasn't run by a family member. In 1953, it was sold to the Coring Company out of Cleveland, and the name was changed again to Coring Watrous. In 1957, increasing environmental restrictions led to the closure of the foundry, which was a key part of the company since its inception. To counteract this, they focused on machinery for forestry operations. And through the mid-1970s, employment was up to 350 people, and in 1980, sales were over $63 million. In 1988, Coring Watrous was sold to Timberjack Equipment and continued in the production of cranes, excavators, and forestry equipment. And in October 1992, the Market Street plant was closed and completely demolished by 1994. Edward L. Gould, W. H. Shhapley, John Muir, and Henry Yeh established the company in 1891 with about a dozen employees. It specialized in galvanized steel windmills, flagstaffs, grain grinders, iron and wood pumps, as well as beekeeping supplies. It also produced lookout towers for forest rangers and pulp and paper companies. At one time, they were the largest windmill factory in Canada. Gould Shhapley and Muir was originally located on Elgin Street, but in 1899, the business occupied 2.5 blocks on the corner of Clarence and Wellington. The Gould Bicycle Co., another of Edward Gould's business ventures, was later sold to create CCM. William Slingsby built the original mill in Homedale in 1872. The business manufactured dress and coat material, blankets, and carriage rugs. The fire destroyed the mill on December 24th, 1876. And the second mill was built the following spring, but destroyed again by fire in December 1902, and later rebuilt a third time. The company was acquired by Frank Cockshed in 1893, and by 1891 was the largest blanket mill in Canada, employing 125 people. That same year, 1,750 blankets were produced each week, with a large portion of them being sent to the Yukon. During the First World War, Slingsby's also manufactured blankets for the Army. That's all for today's journey through Brantford's industrial history. Join us next week for the final podcast of our Culture Days programming, where we will discuss some global superstitions, just in time for Halloween. Thanks for joining us.